Hey, my name's Pastor Brian.
And I'm Kristen.
And this is our story. Everything has a beginning. Really, how it began for me is back when I became a Christian when I was 18 years old at Gold Creek. I very quickly went to Bible college. I got my degree in theology. And I always knew I felt called into ministry, but I never felt called to a position. I always felt called to just go into ministry, even though I spent 7 years as a youth pastor. And it wasn't until the end of that 7 years that Kristen and I, we began to pray and think and dream about what it would look like to start a church through Gold Creek. How that started was we rallied 8 couples together, and I tried to paint the worst picture possible. I asked them to give everything, to serve all the time, and to sacrifice with us to have this crazy dream. How it began after that was I challenged them even to help me door knock. I have a picture of me and Roman knocking on doors all around the Brightwater area at the time. Between myself and our core team, we knocked on over 5,000 doors, inviting people to church. I would wheel Roman with me, hoping it would not scare anybody. It'd be a little less having a kid with you. And as we prayed and believed and thought about what God would do, I genuinely thought there's no better to do a church than at a sewage treatment plant, of all places. In September of 2014, we finally launched after all the anticipation and prayer, and we launched and we had just over 70 people in our first service.
So then we went into the church in the early days. We grew from 2014 to 2017, 70 people is what we started, to 250 people. We were setting up and tearing down every Sunday service. Many of us had to serve 2 services. We wouldn't get an opportunity to go into service. So many volunteers were doing all the roles multiple times. It was a grueling time, but it was a wonderful time because we got to see all the people in our community joining and hearing about God, and we got to serve together. And I remember one Easter service when we had continued to grow, there were so many kids. We had sectioned off a room and we were doing nursery and little kids, and I think even a slightly older kids all in the same room. And we had so many, I thought, we're gonna get hurt. Somebody's gonna get hurt. How can we all hear each other? All the kids were so loud. And I thought, we need to grow. We're outgrowing our space. And so we moved to 3 services. And also, one of the things in the early days we weren't able to do was youth ministry. And so many people would say, we love your church, but we can't stay due to not having youth ministry. So we decided we wanted to launch our youth ministry. So we got to launch that, and then we also then started to get a vision of what it would look like to grow into a new space.
As our church was growing, we had launched 3 services, we had moved around how we did it within that room at Brightwater, and we had really come to our capacity. And then Chris and I began to think and pray, and I began to pray and dream with Pastor Dan at the time, and think about how we can find a permanent home for Gold Creek Woodinville. Through lots of preparation, our first thought was we're gonna go lease lots of the space in Woodinville. And we quickly found out that it was gonna be as much as it would be to attempt to buy and build. And so we started down that road of looking at real estate. And one of the few times in life I really felt like God spoke to me was I was driving southbound on Highway 9, and I stopped at our light, which is Highway 9 and Maltby Road. And at that light, all there was a dilapidated corner store and an old mower shop and a for sale sign behind it. And I felt like God said, this is gonna be the church property. And it was just, it felt like a few months later, we were able to make an offer to the owner of this property. And we have this picture that I snapped in the moment with our attorney and Pastor Dan at the time of us closing and purchasing this property. We were only able to do it because Gold Creek co-signed for our loan to buy this land. And I remember thinking how easy it seemed to be because the process was so simple, it seemed like. And that very same night, I was driving back. It was late at night when we signed those documents with our attorney. I was coming westbound to eastbound on Maltby Road, and I stopped at that exact same light. And I felt like God spoke to me one of the other times in my life where he said, this is going to be the most difficult time of your entire life. And little did I know it was going to be harder than anything I've ever experienced.
There were so many setbacks to come. We had permits for the land, but then there was wetlands and maybe some old salmon on the property at one point in time. This building was going to be too big for what we're zoned for. There were so many things that continually came against us, and we stopped and thought, is this the right thing? Are we doing the right thing? We even got to a point where maybe we had to sell the property, and we were in tears and not understanding why we got to this spot. And at the same time, we had some key volunteers, some really close friends leave the church. And that was the hardest time, thinking, well, not only are we having setbacks, but we're being abandoned. Maybe we're not in the right spot. But we had some other really amazing church members also come and rally behind us and suggest that we go pray for this property, that we fight. I remember someone said, if you believe God can and you say it, then we got to believe that God can. And so we got together and we got on the property. And my favorite moment was walking around. Both our kids were really young at the time. And I had even a strap to where I was carrying my daughter around because it was so important that we would go to every piece of that property. And I remember the children's pastor at the time, envisioning where the children would be. And we all started to view where this church was going to be. And it was so powerful. And it felt like things were freeing at the time, and that we knew God was going to come through, and he did. And then we were able to break ground, and it was so incredible. And we had little setbacks here and then of 2020 and not being able to build, but then the education rights of our preschool helped us to be able to build. And then we were able to meet in drive-in services, and it was so great because people could see the progress of the church being built. It was almost as if God wanted all of us to be there in the process of the build, to see the progress and to see what was to come. And then we got to have our first service in October of 2020. Who knew that that would be the time we would launch our first service? And it's like when you bought a home and it's a new home and all your furniture that you have from your apartment or your old home just doesn't quite fill this new big space. That's how it felt. We had this new big space, and although it was seemingly more than we've ever had in a service before, it was barely enough to fill the room, but it was exciting, and we were ready for it, ready for that launch.
So then we finally really came into having our home. It felt like something that I had dreamed of and prayed for so long. We were almost 7 years of setup and teardown. I always say it was 7 years of agony as we did that, but so much rich spiritual growth happened for our church during that time. But we finally made it into our building, and the prayer and the dream of really having the growth like you pray for finally happened. In 3 years, our church almost tripled in size. In 3 years, we had to double the size of our staff. And in 3 years, we had a preschool that began reaching and bringing all these new people into our church. And in 3 years, we actually ended up coming to the place where we needed to add a third service in our big building. And I was terrified, actually, of it, because our third service going off at Brightwater years ago didn't go as planned. And we made this big jump to add a third service in our big building this last year, and we never looked back. That service immediately filled with brand new people. And now here we are on the edge of our new horizon. You know, today we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary, and it's 10 years of all that God has done through you guys, all that God has done through our church. And I think about all that God has done in just these short first 10 years. What is God going to do in the next 10, 20, 30 years here at church? And so today we celebrate our new season as Compass City Church. And I believe if we lean into God and have the same faith for our future as we have for our past, we will see the city all find their way back to God.